Hi, welcome to Dual Citizens. I'm Stephen McAlpine.
And I'm David Ould.
Well, David, we're not in our normal seats in Sydney CBD today. I'm out in the luxurious suburbs of Sydney. And where are you?
Well, it looked like so much fun, Steve, when you did your thing floating off to New Zealand that I thought I can do it, but bigger and better. I am actually in Sheffield in the north of England, home to two of the things I love most dearly in my life. One is the ever resurgent Sheffield United, and secondly is my mum, who's a
In which order, may I ask you? We've lived in Sheffield.
Don't ask questions you don't want to hear the answer to, mate.
We lived in Sheffield and we went for Sheffield United.
That's the place to go.
For us, it was Sheffield United, your mum, Sheffield Wednesday.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's Sheffield United, my mum, your mum. So that's where we're going. Steve, what are we going to be talking? What can we be talking about again this week? What's been going on?
Oh, I don't know. Well, we're going to look at what I think is going to be the word of the year, vibe. That word has come up a lot. That's one of my words of the year this year anyway. And then we're going to look at Christian and church responses to Donald Trump. And both those things are connected. It's the vibe you're on, as a famous movie in Australia said, and the vibe has shifted. And then we're going to look at the whole election in the US and how that's rippled out across the world. And then we're going to wrap things up by really looking at an issue here. It's a religious issue in Australia. It's a bit of a hot issue at the moment, and it's caused a little bit of consternation and shame in Australia about what's going on among the anti-Semitism issue, especially in Sydney where we are.
Lots to talk about. Let's get to it. So, Steve, the vibe when we first arrived in Australia, my wife and I, over 20 years ago now, we were told one thing we had to absolutely do, is watch that film, The Castle. And of course, there we learnt that great phrase, it's the vibe, Your Honour. And now you want to tell us about the vibe again. What vibe are you talking about now, Stephen, and why do we need to pay attention to it?
Well, for anyone under the age of 40, they may not remember that movie, but The Castle. But the vibe is the word that's being used to describe the sudden shift, at least at the top level, of where we're going politically and culturally. And that's all because of Trump. So if you're seeing, it's not a very technical word, but you're seeing people like Brendan O'Neill from Spiked and Sir Neil Ferguson, saying, as much as they don't like the word, the vibe has shifted culturally and politically, that the whole so-called woke agenda, we'll talk about the word woke as well, has gone because of Trump. And he's just executive orders striking things down. And suddenly it's as if the last 12 years of working up a very progressive framework in all of our institutions has just shifted. And not just in America, but around the world.
I mean, I remember seeing something on the news in Australia before I flew here about how so many fewer of our big companies now are actually talking publicly about their diversity, their inclusion policies. I mean, they might still be doing it, but they're just not making a noise about it anymore. It's something has changed in the air. Something shifted. What's going on, Steve? Money. Well, that's what it is. Talk to us about it.
Yeah. Big corporations took on the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And obviously there are some issues. You know, there's a kernel of truth to everything. But the whole policing of those issues in workplaces dampened down conversations that should have been had. And then the final, I think it was a dead man, or dead whatever pronoun you want to use, walking when the anti-Semitism issue came up in the universities, in the hearings in the United States, when in universities where you could spot a microaggression from 20 paces, the senior leaders on the campus couldn't name anti-Semitism and the fear of Jewish students towards what was happening to them, even when it was in their face. And so from that point on, it felt like it was only a matter of time and it would take an election to sweep that away in the universities. Now, it hasn't gone from the universities, but the corporations, a picture to me of Mark Zuckerberg from 2015 with his clean cut and his smiley look. And I thought, I could take him, you know, and then even I could take him. And then a picture of him this year with curly hair and chains and a bro T-shirt. I go, maybe I can't. And it felt like the biggest corporations had shifted on something.
Yeah. So what's going on behind that, Steve? And particularly again, how as Christians are we meant to understand the thing that is happening there?
Well, ostensibly, people are saying the Trump election spread out across the world, and you're seeing a conservative backlash against some of these issues. But one of the issues with the vibe shift has been we're sick of being school-marmed into how we should behave. It was highly moralistic, the whole vibe thing of DEI and many of the BLM movement. All of those things, while they're addressing some needs, had an overarching, you will comply or else. And it was very schoolmarmish. And what you started to get was people around the edges saying, well, we're not going to take this anymore. And that crept into the center a little bit, but people wouldn't say it until the vibe shifted. And
which is, of course, why Trump is so attractive to so many people, because he was sheltered from that. His wealth and his actually I don't give a damn attitude sheltered him from the repercussions of that, which other people would naturally face. And so it almost became their dare I say it, their David against the Goliath of wokeism. Is that right?
Yeah, the question was, if I'm beyond the pale, if no matter what I think that I'm not racist, you're telling me I am, and no matter what I do, I'm part of the problem, then people go, well, blow that, and they'll just and so that was part of its problem. It could not countenance a space to have difference of opinion without clamping down on it and then using legislation. Now, culturally, it's not changed. If you listen to Bari Weiss's podcast, Honestly, it's a great podcast. There's a couple of good, very left-leaning, in fact, one's a Marxist, guests saying, well, it hasn't gone from the universities and it'll just bide its time. For me, it's like rust. That whole agenda never sleeps. The queer theory, the woke stuff, that is baked into a way of looking at the world. And in fact, Trump's election, for those who are on the extreme of that cohort, actually confirms that this is a fight against evil and that somehow we must double down on this. So it's not going away.
It's not going away. And in a moment, we'll talk about examples of people who are publicly trying to, well, at least be seen to be fighting against it. Are they really fighting against it? I have my own opinions, which I'll let you know about. So how to navigate this, Stephen? We're dual citizens. We're all about thinking how do we live in this world? What's the Christian to do as they see this shift? For some public consciousness, but also some institutions still it's all embedded there.
Yeah, look, I think what you're finding is that Christians are the more conservative bent. And I'm not a third way guy, really. Look, we're just going to say this. I'm a conservative, but Christians of a conservative bent are going, well, we don't like him, but we held our nose, we voted for him, and he's going to give us what we want. And Christians of a more progressive bent are going, Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. That's what's happening. But there's a mistake with both of them that we're going to discuss in the next segment.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, why don't we turn to that now? Because we've got some classic examples of that kind of thinking, right?
Yeah, and look, as a podcast that's dealing with Christian frameworks on issues, I want this next section to be the meat and the sandwich. So we're going to really go hammer and tongs, Dave, and I'm going to pick your brains about everything you think about every Christian perspective on American history.
I have so many opinions, and someone who finally wants to hear them. Let's do it.
Okay, David, it's an interesting time for Christians in the United States. We just talked about it, and we've seen responses, particularly the response in the sermon, homily, whatever you want to call it, by Bishop Flood at the inauguration, and Trump looking like I did at the age of 5 in a stuffy Brethren church in Northern Ireland, waiting for the sermon to finish.
Oh, man.
So tell us what happened there and what's it about?
Oh, what happened? So many things to say. So what literally happened was there was a church service at the National Cathedral in Washington immediately after the election, and Trump sits there with Melania, and Vance is there and his wife and the rest of them. And then Bishop Marion Bird of the Episcopal Church gets up and preaches, well, look, I'm going to call it a sermon, a homily. I'll critique it in a moment. But basically, she, in a soft, gentle, but kind of authoritative voice, the voice of the prophet speaking truth to power, implores Trump to be kinder to. We get the various LGBT things mentioned. We get the immigrant issue, which of course is massive in America at the moment, and implores Mr. President to do better, to be merciful, to be kind, and so on. And of course, as she sits down, the Twitterati erupt. All the lovies just go, "This is marvelous. This is just prophetic. This is what church leaders should be doing." The Christian right go absolutely apoplectic. Trump. It's quite funny to watch he and Vance in the service.
It was like me sitting in church at the age of 6.
Oh man, they're sitting there, and I'm just so. Your first thought is who did the vetting on this? Because those of us who've been watching Anglican things for a while, and you know me, I do the Anglican politics thing, could have told you exactly how this was going to go. So that's the first thing. Who did it? But then you've got to go, well, what is going on here? And I have opinions. What's that? Sorry, Steve.
Well, what is going on? Tell us.
Well, I have opinions. First of all, my kids even asked me today, what do you think about it? And here's what I said to them. I said, look, on one level, you've got to realize this was utterly performative. Now, just bear me out on this.
Okay.
Let's just say this is someone who genuinely wanted to appeal to Trump to get him to change his position on some things. Can I just say, if you present yourself as a bishop, you're meant to have some form of pastoral sensitivity, some sort of experience with how people are and what's most effective in getting what you want from them. Well, this is a spectacular failure, isn't it? Because who actually thinks that Trump is going to be persuaded to do anything by being publicly embarrassed and preached to on a topic on which he's going to take a hard line? Like, who... to me, if this was a person that was genuinely thinking that this would make a difference to the president, the newly elected president, then that is at worst naive.
So they're not actually doing that, though. Is that what you're?
Well, this is my point. So she cannot be that stupid. She really cannot be that stupid. In which case, here's what it was, Steve, and this is only the first thing we want to say about it. It was just an attempt to be seen to be saying something to Trump, as opposed to actually genuinely getting anything out of it. But the thing that was sought was to be seen, to be, the speaking truth to power, although quite frankly, how dangerous it was for her.
Can I just point out, I think that's speaking power to power, because if you were an Episcopalian from a progressive framework in the United States, the culture is going with you. And it did. They all cheered. She was on the breakfast shows the next day and the lunchtime things and doing the interviews and everyone applauding her and so on. So, just an aside, if you speak truth to power in the Episcopalian setting and you're a conservative evangelical,
Marian Budd and her peers were heartlessly cruel, the same cruelty that she accuses Trump of, perhaps even correctly, of in some of the things, that and worse to Orthodox ministers and even other bishops.
In their own diocese.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not saying that a broken clock can't say that, tell the right time twice a day. Right? Right.
For the umpteenth time, let's all just be really clear on who Trump is. But that's the point I'm making. Given who he is, naively foolish if you genuinely thought. But I don't think for a moment she genuinely thought this would make a difference to Trump. She just it was performative. And so, lots of people have been quoting different bits of the Bible about what it looked like. This is Jeremiah. No, it wasn't. These are the people when Jesus says, beware those who stand on the street corner saying their prayers. Why are they on the street corner? Because on a street corner, you can be seen from all directions, can't you?
Yeah.
They get their reward. And in the 48 hours afterwards, Marian Budd got her reward. She got exactly what she worked for. And hurrah, well done, Marian Budd. But
I would say, as preachers of long in the tooth, would say, if you want to convince anyone in the congregation by what you're saying, haranguing them or belittling them in front of other people seems like Ministry 101 failure, doesn't it?
Well, it's at best. It's lazy, but here's the thing that's really going on. You see, she didn't actually use the gospel.
No,
In fact,
no, there's
if you go through it, there's actually no gospel there. There's moralism, and there's a
yeah.
particular political flavor of moralism that's there, but no gospel. And so that's actually, we want to go more fundamentally. That's the issue here, and it's the critique that we can make of theological liberalism. Constantly, that it is ultimately moralistic, which then makes it a works religion. There's no offer of grace. There's no forgiveness that's there. It's just do better, and Mr. President, do better.
Yeah, well, that's
So,
interesting. I wrote about it because I'd seen a flurry of supposed evangelicals or from evangelical networks in Australia praising
oh,
it as a Christ-like sermon. And
oh.
my thought was, I wonder if you get the gospel in the way that it needs to be gotten, or are you just putting a political desire over the top of that? Because as much as you may agree with their politics or not agree with their politics, there wasn't a cruciform or a call to a gospel response as much as it was just a political statement. And then I go, well, what does that say about the state of churches in Australia if that is seen as a prime example of how you preach a sermon?
Well, again, and part of it, I think, is just that Trump does evoke such strong reactions, and
Yeah,
we've spoken about that
visceral
before.
responses.
Always like that Trump derangement syndrome. But then, of course, on the other side, and again, we need to make sure we keep saying this. There is the other TDS, which is the Trump delusional syndrome,
I
where
know.
he is the Messiah. He's not a naughty boy. He is the Messiah, and he's God's great gift to America. And you're beginning to see some of that as well. So we've got the what we might call the Christian conservatives, the inheritors of the moral majority, kind of guys, and they are, and that's kind of more the fields that I'm familiar with. They are overwhelmingly positive about Trump, and of course scathing about Marion Budd, but cheering and hurrahing on all the different things that are going on. I know more than one conservative Christian in America who, on the days after Election Day, went, one guy went, all my prayers have been answered. And I went, really? All your prayers? Was that the
You've
focus
done
of
a
your
little bit
prayers?
for Jesus coming back or praying Maranatha, which would be one of your prayers, surely, if you're,
Well,
yeah.
exactly. And so dare we say it, that this fresh Christian movement, and of course, one of the things that we want to address is this thing called Christian nationalism, which is sort of finding this resurgence. Dare we say it might be in danger of actually making exactly the same mistakes that
Yes,
Marion Budd did.
that's
Now,
what
as we
I
do that,
thought.
perhaps we want to be really careful about defining our terms at this point, because the term Christian nationalism, when some people use it, sort of the media and lazy critics of it, they just basically mean any sort of conservative who
Yes.
has a Christian background, who kind of just wants to wave the moralism flag and just go, let's get back to, here in the UK it was back to basics. Let's get back to this sort of moral way of living. Which again, let's remind our viewers, is basically what Marion Budd's doing as well.
Yeah,
It's
on the
just
other
an appeal
side.
to morals.
So
But no,
this, yeah,
the genuine Christian nationalists, if you listen to them define themselves, it's a bit more thought through than that. It's well, Stephen Wolfe is the classic, The Case for Christian Nationalism. His book, he's making an argument that God has made us in a certain way, and that he made us naturally as people who form into people groups. And so we ought to be cohering in those distinct people groups and forming nations that are somehow saturated with. Well, he wants to say Christian things. My critique in a moment is going to be, actually, I don't think they are Christian things.
yeah,
But
that's interesting. So critique that for me, because my experience of that, and Jake Meador at Mere Orthodoxy, we should put it in the show notes, has a great article on unpacking that. It
yeah,
feels like the Christian national, the quintessential Christian national position is natural law has given us a framework for how we run things, and we'll idealistically pitch that, but how we get from A to B and how many eggs we need to break to get that particular omelette, we can't tell you at this stage.
sure, that's part of it. And let me actually say, I think probably the basic problem, therefore, with Christian nationalism, as guys like Wolfe propound it, is that it never gets from A to B. Let me explain what I mean by that. It's an argument that is grounded, as you said, in a natural law. So it's an argument that's grounded and stays in a particular view of creation. So it asserts some things that are true. Men are made in God's image. We're different to the animals around us. There are then some sort of suggestions about that, if we hadn't fallen, we would be clumped in these sort of national groups.
What if we hadn't? Yet here we are.
So, and at that point, of course, it's what ifs and hypotheticals. I know, and those arguments have been had. But here's the thing that it lacks, and this, I kind of had this aha moment a few months ago reading the book, and actually it resonated with some other things I'd been thinking about that my American friends who love Jesus just kind of, I thought, weren't getting. And here's the thing that it is: it just doesn't have a proper eschatology.
Yes, and that's my complaint, right? Is that the progressive framework has no eschatology, and Christian nationalism has a poor, probably over-realized eschatology at one level.
So let's explain to our viewers what we mean by that. So by eschatology, we mean the things of the eschatos, the things of the end. So this notion that, how can we put it this way, that God's world, his creation, is not static. So God didn't just create and set things up in a certain way and they kind of just stay the same. That's not the case at all. The scripture tells us of and embeds in its narrative this notion that everything is going somewhere. And where is the creation going? Well, it's going to a new creation. It's going to something that's far, far better. So let's take a critique of some of the things that Christian nationalism says, and particularly this notion of people groups. And them staying together. Now, of course, as we critique that, let's be clear on what they're trying to defend. They're trying to defend a thing that we're genuinely seeing in Western society, which is that our cultures, which are historically saturated with Christian thinking, even though we don't know it, and books like Holland's Dominion and Scrivener's The Air We Breathe have more than shown us that. They are getting now inundated by people from other cultures who don't think that way.
That's right.
And so that's, in a sense, diluting it. And there's also sort of an internal dilution. And the Christian nationalists are going, that's not a good thing. To which I think you and I would go, no, it's not a good thing, is it? How do we get back? Well, their argument is we go back to our monocultural, as it were, monoethnic thing, because it was all good then. And my critique is, no, it was never the ethnicity that was the good thing.
No.
It was that the gospel happened to manifest itself and be worked out in this particular people group. But it wasn't the people group that was the issue. It was the gospel. But
That's
more than that, the very same gospel tells the story of disparate people groups brought together.
Well, that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of U2. I don't like some of their stuff, but when I read I Believe in the Kingdom Come, when all the colours bleed into one, I go, that's what I did with my plasticine when I was 6, and I didn't like the grey lumpy colour it became. But the end of the story tells me tribes, tongues, nations standing before the throne.
Multicoloured, variegated. Yes. All together. I mean, I joke with my wife that on that last day, when we're all gathered around the throne, we'll not be married anymore. Jesus tells us that, but it'd be nice to catch up. I say to her, you know where to find me.
Yeah.
Well, you know where to find me, I say to her. Amongst all the crowd swaying and going nuts, I'll be there with the English Anglicans going, jolly good. Jolly good.
That's right.
Yeah. You can find us not cheering us swaying. But so here's my major critique about it, which I think is an issue more generally for American conservative evangelicalism, is it doesn't really, its eschatology is kind of, it has these discrete chunks, these discrete sort of things, but what it doesn't get is that flow that happens in Scripture. We go from a creation that is, well, one man and one woman, and then gets divided in a horrible way at Babel for our own protection, but also for our punishment, with an ultimate purpose of being reunited. And so when the gospel actually impacts communities, And what's the community that it impacts? The church. And we'll come
Yeah.
to why it's not the state, it's the church. What happens? We get this glorious coming together of, well, my growth group in my church, there's a Korean lady, there's a Nigerian couple, there's some Indian guys, there's a guy, there's an Indonesian guy, some white pasty Anglo-Saxons like me. It's brilliant.
But you have more. The great irony is you probably have more understanding together with them of what the world is about than the bloke 2 doors down who lives in your suburb in Sydney, who's also from Sheffield, who's not a Christian. And I think the Christian nationalists don't get that. I guess the question I would have at this point is, how did America conflate Israel and the nation? I mean, obviously that goes back to its founding, but it feels like both the progressive framework and the conservative framework use Old Testament language that's described for the people of God that should be in the New Testament about the people of God and prophetic issues to speak to the nation state in a way that wasn't about the nations around Israel. It was about Israel, the church.
Israel is the gathered people of God, who at that time were a nation as well. But it's the same issue, isn't it? It's about not recognizing that there was this flow from the beginning and the setups to the final conclusion of things that are fulfilled. And so one of those things that gets fulfilled is the nation of Israel. It's a setup for God's people gathered.
Yeah, well, there's the issue, right? The progressive horror show is Gilead from Handmaid's Tale, which is the nation and the state conflated.
Right.
Yet at the same time, we want the progressive framework with very thin eschatology conflates the nation and the state when it uses language about mercy and justice. You go, yes, I think we should have mercy and justice, but your call for it outside the church will inevitably have to look different to what it is within the church.
Exactly, and the basic assumption of the New Testament is we will be living in pagan nations, and so the New Testament never says how will you organize yourself as a Christian nation. It constantly says to me, how will you live as a Christian community amongst a pagan nation?
That's right, and so there's a tweet, lots of tweets about J.D. Vance saying, well, there's a biblical understanding or Christian idea about the nation and the state and the family and order and the neighbor, and gives categories, and then. I don't agree fully with everything he says, but when people say, well, my Bible doesn't say that, I'm going, no, but your Bible, history didn't stop at the end of the canon. For 2,000 years, people have been trying to figure out how the nation and the church work together. And so politics comes into it. And you do read in 1 Timothy 5 that if anyone does not look after the members of their own household, the only time it said they're worse than an unbeliever. Worse than an unbeliever. They're not an unbeliever. They're worse than that. So there was category. So J.D. Vance, even though he probably doesn't have the framework for thinking through it very well, might speak more than he knows. That there is something about the way we've planned this out over 2,000 years since Christ.
That's right.
That nations have to be put together a certain way.
Right, that's right, and the reality is that those nations that had the gospel in them and amongst the people that were there have been historically the most successful ones. And America, of course, becomes the almost the crystallization of it. Come, you scattered masses, they come together, and most of them are they're not just simply political refugees, are they? They're religiously political refugees.
It's a vision of what it means to flourish as a human, right? And so that's a biblical understanding. So what you get in America, which is the first trial of what does it look like to have a no state religion, is a very religious place.
Absolutely.
Ironically, and very religious language. And if you look at the early American art, Robert Hughes' book American Visions talks about this. American art in the first wave looked Edenic. It looked like the Garden of Eden. Even they put on these glasses that were biblical, and they looked at a very different landscape and painted it as Eden. And that's that whole New Jerusalem aspect of it. And even as America becomes less Christian and post-Christian in some places, it's very Christian in its post-Christian understanding of life.
And I'm just thinking historically, perhaps that why it just occurs to me, Stephen, perhaps that's why it's America where the Mormons, the whole
Yes.
Mormon thing kicks off for the very same reason, because it just appeals to that very same thing. We are the new tribes of Israel. We're the new,
Yeah.
this is the nation that God is building / the church, and so it's been this thing that. There's other topics as well I want to say where you see the same mistake, but it's working its way out now in this one, wanting to
Yeah.
defend good things, but not understanding quite how they ought to be defended
Yeah.
and grappled with.
Let's wrap this up by this line from Al Mohler, who we spoke to a few weeks ago,
Hmm.
Dr. Mohler, where he said, if you're a Christian, you can't be too happy with the election result and you can't be too unhappy with the election result. The gospel is a leveler, and it's a good pH test for us as to where our hopes lie, I think.
It is. Clowns to the left of us, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you, Steve.
Yeah. Well, not yet, but not 13,000 miles later. So next up, we're just going to have a quick look at an issue that's happening here in Sydney right before our eyes.
Let's get to it. All right, Steve. So I left Australia less than a week ago, and I left in a week that just saw almost daily now anti-Semitic attacks. And then even on the news while I've been away, I've seen another horrendous attack. It looks like at a school and a caravan full of explosives. What's going on? What's been happening? And what's going on?
Look, yeah, the anti-Semitism in Australia seems to be off the charts compared to other Western nations. There's been the leafy suburbs of Sydney and places where there have been long held Jewish communities are being attacked, vandalised. It's been, paint. It's been bombings. It's been fire bombings. It's been attacks on cars. And Jewish people in Australia are saying enough is enough. Yet it seems the New South Wales government, Chris Minns, has come down hard, but it feels like the federal government is trying to hold the tension of those who want something done about it and those on the more left framework who see Israel as the problem and want to have this idea of Jewishness apart from a Jewish state.
Yeah, so look, obviously the Israel-Gaza thing we're not going to solve in 2 minutes. We do want to return to this whole question of anti-Semitism, and we'll think about the church and its relationship to this whole thing in another episode. But you said that the Labour government, well, the federal Labour government is struggling to hold in tension. So what are the forces that are at work that it's trying to grapple with it? It can't simply just be that there's a bunch of Muslims whose vote they want.
No, and I don't think that's what I've seen. What I've seen is well-educated, well-heeled Westerners who have a framework of critical race theory, who have a framework of the colonial, having events at universities. And it doesn't seem like it's the average Western suburb imam who's having a go at anything.
No.
It feels like the opposite of that.
And what's really interesting is that a number of the people arrested for these anti-Semitic attacks, very few of them are quite clearly Muslims, right?
Yeah. No, and it's from the right and from the left, which is worrying, right? And
yes.
So what you're seeing, I think, is the permission to do it. And what happened is the government did not clamp down on it early. So, and people don't have confidence in the government that they will say anything about it. Now, I'm going to say the vibe shift might come back to bite the Prime Minister on the bum come the next election. And one of the issues will be this, but people have been quietish about it. If you went to Melbourne a year ago and you walked down the street on a Sunday or a Saturday, it was a scary place to be. And if you were Jewish, you probably wouldn't go out.
Exactly. And I did notice, like last week, there was a small, pitiful, ludicrous, actually, quite laughable little protest by some neo-Nazis in South Australia. And the police clamped down on them really, really quickly. And I know that on Twitter, the charges were concealment, so like face concealing, attempt to conceal, and some other stuff.
But you can do 10,000 of those things in Melbourne. And nothing.
Well, here's the thing. What good on the South Australian government and the police there for dealing with that promptly. I mean, literal Nazis out on the street.
How did that happen?
Yeah, there are some limits to free speech, and that's probably everything. But here's the thing. What did they actually do that we haven't seen weekend after weekend on our streets? Faces being covered, support of proscribed terrorist organizations, and well, it all kicked off, didn't it? Right after the whole the whole October massacre began, and then we had that first protest that went to the Opera House, and
Look, it hasn't gone away from Sydney, because I was running the other week around the Bay in Sydney, inner west. Good progressive people that we are, and I ran past two women, well-heeled older women, one carrying a Palestinian umbrella because it was raining, which said "from the river to the sea."
Yeah.
And so once you've normalised it at that level, where you've got umbrellas with it printed, carried by old ladies, then you've got a problem.
Which is a straight genocide. That is a genuine genocidal thing. River to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is free from Jews. That's what it means, right?
Yes. And so it does mean that. And maybe she might be horrified to think that, but there's a virtue signal aspect of it. And I think the vibe will shift. I think surely we'll get to the point where we're disgusted enough with it as a people that we'll push harder against it. But I think people are cowed into silence on it. And that comes from the cultural push. And so Jewish people are starting to speak up. And I notice that it goes from the Australian newspaper, Conservative. Eventually it's front page Sydney Morning Herald and The Age nearly every day at the moment.
And it will be telling when we get those commentators going, enough is enough. This cannot stand.
Yeah.
At the moment, it seems to me it's still in the zone where it's the political battle. It's one side accusing the other side of politicizing it,
and
as opposed to both sides.
Wants that. I think he wants it resolved, but he doesn't know how to within his own party.
In his own party, he's got the hard left, particularly in Victoria and everywhere, for whom that paradigm of oppressor and oppressed is just the dominant way they still perceive everything, right?
It is.
So the vibe is still there. The vibe is still there. Why don't we say that?
Yeah, the vibe is still there. Things might change. We'll see where it goes. But something has to change. And we'll talk about that in a future episode, because this isn't going away.
It's not.
Dave, let's wrap it up. We've had the vibe, we've had Trump, we've had anti-Semitism. What's our gospel outtake on this?
Steve, surely our gospel outro is called, I mean, it sounds simplistic, but I want to go, let's just keep the gospel the gospel. It doesn't mean you can't have opinions on these different things. It doesn't mean that you can't look at the Israel-Gaza thing and have a view on it. It doesn't mean you can't look at Trump and have a view on him, whatever it's going to be. But at the end of the day, friends, what is our great hope for the world? That the political animals will go, well, it's Trump or it's not Trump. That's the great hope. That's the answer to all my prayers, to use that language we went from earlier, right? We turn to the Israel thing. People will have their different paradigms. It's the oppressor oppressed, sort that out, whatever it may be. It may just be stamp on all the filthy people doing this. That's not the answer either. What's the answer? It's the gospel. It's the gospel that brings together, well, what did I say earlier? It brings together me and a Nigerian couple and the South Korean lady and the Indian guy and the Indonesian guy and the Chinese girl. It's the gospel of Jesus and the forgiveness that he brings and the way that he takes this disparate people from all over the world and gives us this eschatological vision of us all gathered around the throne together, singing the same song.
Yeah.
So myriad voices.
Yeah. The gospel doesn't change.
That's the vibe.
And the vibe will change back again, right? So whatever 4 years you get, you might get 10 years the other way.
Yeah.
The gospel
so
but
I would say it's worth saying that whatever the cultural vibe is, it will never be the gospel vibe.
That's right.
And we need, this is the great Christian nationalist mistake as well, isn't it? As well as the theological liberals, that they think that those two things can become, univocal. They're never going to be Christian. You will always be singing a different song. You will always be vibing a different vibe to the world around you until the Lord Jesus Christ comes back and makes everything new. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be talking about other people's vibes and trying to change those vibes and wanting the best, but that is not where our hope is. Our hope is for that day when Jesus comes back, and we work out that the vibe that we were on is the vibe that wins.
Yeah, and to wrap it up, maybe the word of the year is vibe, but our word of the year every year should be Maranatha, come Lord Jesus.
Come, Lord Jesus. Absolutely right. That's what we're hanging out for. Not Trump, not Marion Budd, not even a solving of the Gaza-Israel thing, but Jesus coming back and sorting it all out.
Yeah. And speaking of coming back, see you next time when you're back in Sydney.
I'll be back in town. I'll bring you some Sheffield United gear if you want.
No, I'll burn it in the streets.
It's not worth anything. That's why. See you, Steve.
Yeah.